All right, so I was thinking I could finish chapter 12, but the thing about expository preaching is it starts with expository study, and when you start with expository study and you begin to figure out more stuff and how it connects, you end up slowing down and you don't have as much ground covered as quickly as you thought you might. And so today, we're going to be in chapter 12, but I was going through it trying to think. The eschatology is a tricky subject for a few reasons, and one of which is the subject matter is sometimes interesting in theory but difficult in presentation. By that I mean you have interwoven theology, which is a bit easier to exposit, and then you have narrative. And so if you go through the Gospels, you're expositing narrative of he went here, he did this in this town and said this at such and such a time, and you're intermingling that with doctrinal truth that is said throughout. Same thing with something like Acts. And Revelation's like that in terms of having a narrative structure where there are things that are happening and times and events, and interwoven throughout those are doctrinal statements and declarations. And so especially with a text as difficult and visionary and picturesque as Revelation 12, with the dragon and woman and water coming out of its mouth and the earth opening up and swallowing the water to preserve the woman, these are things that are already difficult on their own. But then you have a statement made in that context that is doctrinally clear, it is theologically profound, and it is interconnected with the gospel. But it would be easy enough to just take that and ignore all the surrounding context. And so when you're looking at chapter 12, you could think that it would be pretty easy to look down and say, at verse 10 all the way down to verse 12, and going into the overcoming with the blood of the Lamb and the kingdom of God, or the power and the authority of Christ on the earth, and the accuser being thrown down, this is all well and good, but the context is what makes it interesting to me. And so trying to think about how do you present something that seems like a conspiracy, that seems is a bunch of imagery and is difficult and tricky and debated upon, how do you present something like that? But then I began thinking more about the overall context in which these things are happening. It is a difficult text at first until you understand the overall narrative. And that is, this is, to put it in more, theatrical terms, this is the grand display of the universe on full view and just absolutely unhindered. But it's difficult to kind of comprehend, and this is where I was trying to wrap my head around it. So, before we get into this, I just want to kind of paint the context for you as I had it painted in my head last night while thinking through this. I was listening to a somewhat well-known, there was a bunch of random clips going through my phone, and one of them was a well-known scientist who was very secular, definitely by no means God-believing of any sort, atheistic up to the end. And he was talking about space and time and relativity and so on. And while I'm sure their calculations are probably off, if they can't get the time, the age of the earth correct, there's no way they're getting everything else correct, at least not down to the dot. But mathematically, you think about the world as it is, creation as it is, mathematics, science, these are our attempts to understand the world around us, how things work. We are playing catch up to a reality that pre-existed us. And so he was talking about the speed of light and Einstein's theory of relativity and black holes and debates around them and what it is. And I thought it was interesting the more listening to it because he said something fascinating. He was talking about the speed of light, which was approximately 130 some odd thousand miles per hour. And he said, while that sounds really fast, he said that still means that it has a limit, that light can only move so fast, and we perceive time by what we see and what we know, and that is visualized through light. And so this is where then the theory comes that if you can move faster than light, then you're beginning to now alter time and space, and you can now travel through time, and yada, yada, yada. And they got down a wormhole there. But between this guy and another guy, we were talking about the scale of the universe. And he said that Light moves around 130,000 miles per hour, and it would take a beam of light approximately 100,000 light years to get from one side of the Milky Way to the other. And that's obviously a very long time. And then from that, they then estimate that there are somewhere in the ballpark of 13 trillion galaxies or 17 trillion, somewhere in that big number. And just growing the scale of the universe to try to get an idea of how big it actually is. And then the guy that was being interviewed said, human beings struggle with this idea, this scale, thinking, well, the universe is so big, but the reason they don't like it is because that means that, relatively speaking, we are quite small. Now, the word he used was that we are insignificant in the grand scale, and that the Earth rotating around a relatively insignificant star in by no means the largest galaxy or solar system and everything in it, we're relatively insignificant in the grand scheme of things. And his conclusion to that was to say, well, and that's just what we have to accept, that we are insignificant and we're not as important as we thought. But what's fascinating to me is to think through, okay, why would God create the universe so big? What's the point? Why not just make it one galaxy and one solar system and shrink it down for scale? And why not make the Earth the center of it? He could have. He is not bound to the rules of space and time. He wrote them. So why do that? Why limit our universe to such a small, insignificant part, or our galaxy in a small, insignificant part of the universe? And then I started thinking about it from the more biblical narrative. Start at the grand scheme of the universe, right? This is what the psalmist begins with. When I consider the sun and the moon and the stars and the works of your hands, looking up and realizing the seemingly infinite size of space and how large it is and how tiny we are by comparison, and considering how massive and interconnected and meticulously designed it is. And then you zoom in and you find among the trillions of galaxies this little-ish sort of insignificant galaxy. And in that galaxy you find all kinds of stars and planets and unknown mysteries. And it's already quite significant to look at just from that point of view. But then you zoom in and you find a little solar system with a bunch of planets rotating around a relatively insignificant star. You would have not picked the star out of all the stars that you could have looked at. And then you find this tiny little blop of a planet just kind of floating around. And it's one of the only planets that has life, but it is not the largest planet by any means. And you think, all right, well, there's these tiny little microscopic cells that live on this thing called humans, and they move around. And you have a lot of them relative to the size of the Earth and its overall population, but you have this insignificant little blob in the grand scheme of the universe. And then you zoom in and you say, all right, well, if you're God the creator, all right, you've picked a weird planet. Doesn't make sense why you'd pick this one, but you pick this one to inhabit with mankind. And so which of the nations of these would you pick? And then you zoom in more and you find that God picks the least of the nations. He picks the smallest, the insignificant of the nations. And then amongst those, he picks, as Paul says to the Corinthians, he picks the nobodies, the nothings. And then it kind of hit me. The design of the universe, its scale, why it is so big, is to illustrate not God's limitation. God is not limited by any of these things, but that when he picks something like the woman, and that she is demonstrated as being Israel in this grand battle and this back and forth that seems to be going on, and you realize that the whole design of the universe, that it has grand scale, is to illustrate that God does not pick the grandest. He built the grandest to demonstrate that he picks the insignificant. That in order to find where God's hand was working his redemptive work, you have to go and look for the nobodies. You have to pick the insignificant galaxy with the insignificant solar system, to the insignificant star, to the insignificant planet, to the insignificant nation, to the insignificant people in that nation. And you zoom in all the way until you find nobodies. And that everything built around this is to demonstrate that God is not bound to scale. But then thinking more about it, thinking about time and the fact that mathematically we can theorize and begin to demonstrate that time is itself a created thing, and you zoom back out and you realize that time is technically a physical entity of sorts, and is our ability to comprehend what's going around us, and then our inability to wrap our head around time and to understand what it is we're looking at. You then start to realize within the scale of the universe that the universe is itself created. And then you pull back and you realize that in this grand scheme of things, in this massive picture, how intricate and unfathomable is the God who made it and the realm in which he dwells. That if this universe is so big and it is just a created entity, it is just the stage upon which the tale of redemption is played out, and then you begin to realize that our limitations are bound to time, and how we understand anything is bound to time, and we cannot comprehend a world without time. And then you begin to realize that God is not bound to time, and that he made it and uses it, but is not limited to it. Then when you zoom out and you realize the scale of the universe and the scale of these things, and then you see this demonstration of things happening in heaven, we cannot begin to wrap our head around what's playing out here, about what it is actually like to be in that spiritual realm, as it were. That if you were to die tonight and go to heaven, you cannot begin to calculate what it would be like, because even mathematically, if we struggle to understand the world we live in here, and that we're still trying to catch up with it, and just have to theorize things that are outside of our grasp, then you can only imagine how just incapable we are of putting our heads around these things. And so, understanding those two things, the grand scale of the universe and how God zeroes in on the insignificant, and then on the top of that, pulling back out to the grand scale of the universe and realizing that heaven is much grander and God is much grander, and you do not have the ability to understand what it is like to be there. You couldn't understand what it is like to be there. You are just not designed right now to know. Then when we go and realize that what John is doing here, as he is pulled from there, the island of Patmos, and brought in to see not only the future, not only to see things as they pertain to the earth and what's going to happen, but you follow and you understand that the perspective from which he is seeing this is from the top down, that he has been effectively pulled through the universe all the way outside of this creation into heaven to then watch from heaven's point of view how God is doing these things. You begin to see that John writing these images, this is God effectively doing him a favor by giving him something to write down that we could kind of grasp. If John were to attempt to write down what is actually going on in any level of detail, we would not understand it. John wouldn't have the words to describe it. This is massive in scale. We might think in the throne room and the Lamb taking the scroll that we have this kind of limited image of this big room, even maybe clouds with the sky in the distance, but you just can't begin to understand the scale of these things that are happening. So within that context, we then now get this little glimpse into the inner workings behind the scenes. And so in chapter 12, John is just finished seeing the temple and heaven opened and the ark appearing in the temple, and there's flashes of lightning and sounds and peals of thunder and an earthquake and a great hailstorm. We went over that previously. And then he gets to see a great sign which appeared in heaven. And so when we talked about the word great there, meaning mega, again, we struggle to understand the size of what John is seeing, but he is being given a large demonstration of something significant. And in that demonstration, he sees a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars, and this is representing the nation of Israel, of elect Israel. And she was with child, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. And then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems, and this representing the devil and his inner workings with the nations. And his tail swept away 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child. And so here we see the attempt to destroy the Christ as he's coming down to the earth. And then she gave birth to a son, a male, who is to rule all of the nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, so that there she would be nourished for 1,260 days. That's where we left off last time. Now, we are jumping forward in time to see a new event. John is now about to see something play out that seems a bit unprecedented to us, a bit perhaps confusing at first. And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon. And the dragon and his angels waged war, and they were not strong enough. And there was no longer a place found for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down, he who accuses them before our God day and night. And they overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb and because of the word of their testimony. And they did not love their life even when faced with death. For this reason, rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, knowing that he has only a short time. Last time we covered the details regarding the devil and his history and his function and who he is and what he does, and that by design his whole point, his whole purpose is to simply accuse and to tempt so that he may have accusations, and that he is plotting and constantly scheming, attempting to be able to bring charges up to heaven, to the throne of God, to then level accusations against people. And this is his title here. He's called the accuser. He is effectively the equivalent of a prosecutor. His job is to tempt people into scenarios so he can gather evidence, bring it before the judge, and attempt to get you condemned. And this is what he does day and night. This is his nature. And last time we went through the different texts that address this, that would be relevant to this, that demonstrate this function. But now we get to look at his fate. Because he's been doing this day and night for a very long time, since likely the beginning of the earth when Adam and Eve fell, he had his work cut out for him, and off he went. Going over and over. He was there when Adam and Eve did fall, and he's been there since. We see him in Job approaching the throne. We see him approaching the throne again in Zechariah to level accusations. And he's been doing this day and night, over and over, over and over. Peter's still warning about him, that he is going around the earth seeking whom he may devour and trying to lead you into sin. So what does he have to look forward to? Well, there's war. And this seems odd at first. Heaven, after all, is the place of peace, right? When you die, you go to heaven, there's no more conflict. If there's no more sadness and death and pain, then why is there war? What could possibly be in view here? Why is it you can have a view of heaven and everything that goes into it, and yet you have conflict? And the word for war here is not a confusing word. It's not some hidden word with some abstract meaning. It's generally the same idea that was seen in Matthew 24, where Christ warns of wars and rumors of wars, indicating a conflict between two sides. In that context, the wars would be in reference to nation rising against nation, where both sides struggle back and forth over land, resources, politics, etc., any number of reasons that wars are fought. This could lead us to envision a struggle in heaven as the angels fight against the devil in a back-and-forth battle, which would at first appear to be an epic sequence of events, but at the same time would seem rather uncharacteristic of heaven, which is supposed to be the capital of rest and peace. So how is there war? How is there a conflict? And I think it stems in part from our general understanding of war. We're so interested in neat concepts that we think, there's angels, which we don't know an awful lot about, and there's demons, which we don't know an awful lot about, and we have an angel by name and the dragon, and they're duking it out, and so we can come up with images and ideas of there's this struggle, and the saints are wondering if the angels are going to win and come out on top. The wrong idea entirely. War, technically speaking, does not mean that both sides are struggling. War simply means that there are two sides involved in a conflict. As to the nature of that conflict and the outcome and the sides and how it plays out, that's where the context kicks in. In this context, the two sides would be Michael with the angels, warring against the dragon and his angels. But as to the nature of this war, considering the entire context, for example, this is not a war wherein the dragon stands a chance. As discussed previously, there is no part of these things, nor in any other text, which reflects the idea that Satan stands a chance. Both the devil and his angels always seem to be in a posture of preparedness of judgment and fear of when it will come. They are never seen as having the upper hand. There is no text that gives the idea that the devil and his angels ever stand a chance. There is none that says, and if God wins, or if the devil falls, or if he loses. It's just never there. It's really not. There is no nature in which the devil ever seems to even think he has a chance. The reason he does what he does is because it is his nature. It is what he does. This is why he is given the title that he is given. Even well before this, you have the demons on the earth wondering, has the time come? No, they're not even fighting back. They just want to know if the time of judgment has been coming, that they would be cast away, and they're afraid, but they can't really do anything about it. So that begs the question then, why is there war? To understand the nature and purpose of this war, you need to look at the outcome of it. The dragon and his angels are kicked out of heaven. And therein lies the purpose of the conflict, which, when you connect it with the overall context, reveals to us that the war is instigated by God against the dragon. And I think some give this idea that it is the other way around, that Satan decides to start fighting God and God has enough of him and kicks him out. But that's not what's going on here. It is God who instigates the war against the dragon so that he would be driven out of heaven. As to why there is war, why that word is used and depicted here, it is simply because the dragon and his angels attempt to resist and fight back. That's the only reason there's war. Otherwise, it would just be an eviction. But there's war because they don't want to go. Though they do so with absolutely no chance of success. Effectively, this is an eviction of the devil against his will, where he is dragged out of heaven kicking and screaming. This is why we have the depiction here of war. It is not as though he stands a chance. It is not as though he has this massive army and they go back and forth and wondering who's going to win and who's not. That's not what's going on here. There is a conflict, there is a battle, because he simply tries to not go. He's resisting. But there's not much he can do about that. It begs another question, though, and this is one that for some reason the commentators went a bit back and forth on. There is war, and it's in heaven. And the first question that would come up is, well, what heaven are we talking about? Many commentators, and I put this in there mostly for fun, so you know some of the stuff I have to filter through. Many commentators say that this heaven is symbolic of the Roman Empire. And when I first read that, I thought I wasn't quite sure what to do with that. This is clearly not motivated by a plain handling of the text. I don't know about you, but when I read through this, in fact, when I read through the entirety of Revelation, the word Rome did not appear once. So it's not motivated by a plain handling of the text, but rather there are conclusions about other texts. In other words, they're kind of forced into saying this. Since they refuse to accept the place of Israel, ethnic and literal, in the future and interpret the woman as being the church, and because they say these events are all, if not most, in the past, including the coming of Christ, they are forced to make bizarre and irrational conclusions such as this. They have to, because what else could it be? It can't be war in literal heaven because all of Revelation is symbolic, so we have to understand what it is symbolic of. And so Rome, being their favorite scapegoat for anything they don't know what to do with, they decide to plunk it here. There is nothing in this text which necessitates heaven referring to the Roman Empire nor any other empire. At no point is heaven described as any sort of empire that I'm aware of could find, especially not in this context. So, some might conclude that this is referring to the sky or the space, the heavens above. To a certain extent, it would seem that this would be within context, as John sees the images in the heavens in verse 1 and verse 3. He looks up to the sky, as it were, and sees great signs in the heavens. And while this is technically correct in that context, it still begs what is meant by war occurring there, as well as the limits of its boundaries. So if we say, all right, well, this war in heaven is taking place in the sky, and John is looking up in space and the clouds, and he sees this back and forth. Well, okay, why there? What reason would it be going on there? And what's the limitation? Does it come down to Earth? Is it going out just into space? Well, what's the limits there? For example, is it simply that spiritual warfare exclusively occurs in heaven and on earth, but nothing like this ever happens in heaven itself? This idea that it must be the sky is generally predicated off the idea that we just can't accept the idea that there would be conflict in heaven. If this is to be the interpretation, then we would also need to conclude that Satan and his angels are cast out of the heavens when they previously had a place which has now been taken away. The meaning of this would be subject to random guesses as to what it means, because why they have a place in the skies, I'm not entirely sure. There's not really a pre-existing narrative for that. So what is the answer? Right? If it's not the Roman Empire, which I'm not going to spend time on any more than I already have, and if it's not the sky, that leaves one other option. It is best looked at in terms of heaven itself, as this would explain the declaration of where they no longer have a place. It is not simply referring to just some concept of places. It is referring to a specific place. That the devil and angels are cast out and that they no longer have a place implies that they had a designated spot that they could be there. It's as though they're being evicted from a room, and if they have a room, that means that they're in the building. Before anyone panics about the possibility of war occurring in heaven, and we're really supposed to be not too concerned about that, but you need to keep in mind what is meant here by looking at the wording in the context of what's going on, why there would be war. What is meant by war is not that Satan and his angels stand a chance, as we've gone back, or we discussed earlier. On the contrary, the purpose of this conflict is stated by the results, to kick Satan and his angels out. Why? Why is this going on? I mean, you could beg the question as to why Satan and his angels had a place there to begin with. What were they doing in heaven? So they have to have a place already, which is then taken away. And as discussed previously, the devil regularly approached the throne in heaven, not simply in the heavens. He was seen gathering with the other sons of God in heaven before the throne, and God asks him what he's doing, as we talked about before. And so he approaches the throne in heaven itself, where he accuses the brethren day and night. And as seen in Job, Satan regularly appears before God to give an account of what he is doing on the earth. We can speculate that the demons do the same, since this text here says that the devil and his angels no longer have a place. So we can assume that demons have some sort of place here, as they are seen as having a place to lose in the same way. It is possible that one of these demons was seen in 1 Kings 22, where you see the crown of being standing before the throne, and God asks who will go down and entice Ahab to go to war. And so one of the angels comes down and says, I will do it, and I will be a deceiving spirit in the mouth of his prophets. And so you could guess that that could be a demon in his place, just offering up his function, similar to the way the devil is used to tempt Job. It's a speculation. It doesn't really give that title. That's just a guess as to an example for this. When the devil is cast out, as a result of this war, he is no longer permitted to approach the throne to accuse the saints. This is a very big deal, as this will be specifically stated by the loud voice as a cause of celebration for those in heaven. In other words, when he's cast out and he no longer has a place, a declaration is made in heaven for everyone there to celebrate this fact, which implies that something big has just gone down. So how does God do this? This is where we get now to our interactive portion, or the chart. So how does God choose to evict the devil? He's kicked out, he's no longer allowed to have a place, and there's a conflict because he doesn't want to go. So as we discussed last time, the devil is depicted as a dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and he has crowns or diadems on them. And this is representative of the fact, similar to what's going to happen in the next chapter, that he has influence over certain kings and kingdoms on the earth. And so he is viewed in this context, for the sake of chapter 13, as a dragon with multiple heads. And we see him warring against Israel, trying to eradicate or devour her or destroy her in whatever means he can. And he'll try a few times throughout this narrative before finally changing targets. So God is going to take the dragon and no longer permit him in heaven. What tool, what means does he use to demonstrate this? Well, this is something that would be relatively easy to gloss over, but we're going to run with it. Down in verse 7. And there was war in heaven, Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels waging war. And Michael is not mentioned very often in the Bible. Of all the references in the Bible regarding Michael, he is only mentioned 5 times by name. He is given the title of archangel, or the archangel, as though there is only one. And he is alluded to in 1 Thessalonians when Paul references the last trumpet and the voice of the archangel. And so Michael is a both significant but also rarely appearing figure. And here we see one of his very rare appearances. And this is to demonstrate that he serves a certain kind of function. So Gabriel, for example, by contrast, Gabriel we see constantly doing one thing. He is always giving messages. He shows up to Joseph and to Mary, and we see him even referenced in Daniel. He shows up giving messages. So that is his function. It fits within the title of an angel. But Michael, the archangel, serves a very almost militaristic function. We see him referenced in Daniel, which we'll get to in a second. He is referenced in Daniel at least 3 different times. And in those contexts, he is seen in a context of war or conflict. He is then, of course, referenced in 1 Thessalonians, where we see the second coming of Christ, which is inherently a sort of conflict of sorts. And it is the day of judgment and wrath, and so his voice is used with the last trumpet there. And so we see his function is militaristic almost. He is an angel designed for the purpose of war and settling conflict. And so when God brings up Michael the archangel now in chapter 12, because the time has expired for the devil and his angels to have any place in heaven, you can start to get the idea of why war kicks out. The devil's going to try to resist, and so God puts at the head of this the angel designed for this purpose. So Michael shows up here. And I believe that it is very clear that we can understand why not only Michael shows up here, but this helps us figure out the answer to another question I had. And that question that I've mentioned before is, where do we put Revelation 12? If I draw out a timeline of events that we have eschatologically, and we understand from Daniel and Zechariah and Matthew 24 and Thessalonians and Revelation, and we draw it out and we say, okay, where do you put Revelation 12? We've already discussed that the first part of chapter 12 is giving a big picture context for the birth of Christ and the devil's attempts to devour him and destroy him, and so we know where to put that. But what about this war in heaven? Where do we put this? Why is this being brought up? And it's a difficult one initially because it's smack dab in the middle of the book. It's not at the beginning. It's not at the end. It's right in the middle, and it seems to be a change of pace. The nature of what's being discussed has changed. We go from chronological events being described to all of a sudden using visions and imagery. So where do we put it? And this was the question I had. Where do we put this part of chapter 12 and the rest of it leading up to chapter 13 with the beast from the sea and the whole idea of the Antichrist and the horn and the beast from the earth and the mark? Where do we put this one? How does this fit in? Because if you can understand where this second part of chapter 12 goes, then you can start to figure out where to put chapter 13 and what events line up with it. And the key comes down to Michael. Because again, one of the benefits we have that Michael the archangel is mentioned so rarely and yet serves such a particular function helps us pin down where to put this. So let's have a little fun here. One of my markers, note this one isn't dried out. So I've drawn this chart thousands of times, both for myself and for others, and we're going to do a very simplistic version of a timeline of events here. And we're not going to do all of it. We're just going to do a little bit for the sake of space. So let's say, try to draw it simple enough. We have our period of 3.5 years. Goes through Great Tribulation, 1,260 days, time times and half a time, 42 months. Right? This is kind of the groundwork from which you can work from all kinds of different timelines. This is the day of the Lord. This is the time when a whole bunch of this stuff is going down. And so we'll start with that. And we ask the question, where do we put these things? Now, the Great Tribulation is mentioned only a handful of times in the entire Bible. And by name, it is only mentioned a couple of times. Revelation never uses the title. In fact, Revelation doesn't even mention the abomination of desolation. And so thanks to that, it has been somewhat tricky to try to put together what parts of Revelation belong where, because it seems to omit certain titles that we're used to. But we know that from Matthew 24, Jesus is referencing Daniel when he references the abomination of desolation and then says there will be the Great Tribulation. And so we benefit from that, but we need to go back to what Jesus pointed to in Daniel to understand what he's referencing. Because Jesus directly references Daniel by name so that the listeners and the readers would understand what he was talking about. The abomination of desolation is mentioned a couple of times in Daniel in a couple of different places, but the one that Jesus is referencing is Daniel 11. So, to understand where we're putting this here, we have 3.5 years of Great Tribulation. We can call this the Day of the Lord. This is where a lot of the stuff is happening. And I won't get into too many details, but a bunch of other stuff happens before, and some stuff happens after. Now, this dragon being cast out of heaven is already interesting enough, but as I read earlier, when the declaration is made, "Rejoice, O heavens, because the accuser of the brethren has been cast down," a contrasting statement is made. Woe to the earth and woe to those who are on the earth and the sea, because the dragon has been cast down to, and he has having great wrath, because he knows he has a short time. Kind of gives us a hint as to where to put it. But where does Michael fit into all of this? Where do we put this? I've read this before. I don't know if any of you can think off the top of your head where I'm going next, but Daniel chapter 12. So Daniel chapter 11 has begun by giving us this long narrative of the king of the north, this last king who will present the abomination of desolation and declare himself to be equivalent with God, as we learn through Thessalonians, and we have this description of him. And Daniel 11's primary function is to give you his context as to how he shows up on the scene and how he rules his nation. And there's a back and forth and conflict within his own nation and how he gets to power and so on. But then chapter 12 describes his downfall. And take note of how chapter 12 begins in verse 1. Now at that time, Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise, and there will then be a time of distress such has never occurred since there was a nation until that time. So this is only the second time Michael shows up in Daniel. And what he's saying here is that following the events of chapter 11, where the king of the north rises to power, exalts himself above every other god and object of worship, and exalts himself exceedingly, and sets up the abomination of desolation. And then Jesus references that reference to the abomination of desolation. And in Matthew 24, when you see the abomination of desolation, those who are in Judea should flee to the mountains. Why? Because then there will be a time of great tribulation. And he's referencing this text. So according to Jesus, the abomination of desolation will show up. You have a small fraction amount of time to get out of Dodge before the great tribulation begins. So that's what Jesus referenced, but Jesus doesn't reference Michael, but John does. So putting them together, if we have here, let's see if I can write clearly enough. The abomination of desolation as the beginning point, around the beginning point of the Great Tribulation. And Jesus says that will kick it off, as referenced of Daniel. And then Daniel references the Great Tribulation at the beginning of chapter 12 and says that it will happen when Michael arises. Then we can put him right here at the same time. And this is where it gets really cool to me. I love this sort of stuff because you start to piece it together, it starts to make sense. What is Michael called in Revelation 12, or Daniel 12? The great prince who stands guard over your people. Whose people? Daniel's people. Who were Daniel's people? The woman. If the woman represents Israel, and the dragon is trying to destroy Israel, and the abomination of desolation is set up, and Michael the prince rises up. And the idea of rises up meaning it's his time. He has been summoned. It is the beginning of his work. He has been called up to action. He is rising up at the same time the Great Tribulation is starting up. It means that the prince who stands guard over Israel has now been called up to do his job. Michael never defends anybody else. You never see him in any other narrative with any other people other than Israel. So he's not saying that Michael, the great prince, happens to stand guard over all the peoples, including yours. His sole function, militaristically, is to stand guard over the people of Israel, over the woman who gave birth to the child. So chronologically, it makes sense as to why he shows up here. And so when Michael arises, and the reason there is a time of great distress such as never occurred is because Michael arises, kicks the dragon out of heaven, he goes to the earth, and the statement is made, woe to the earth, because he has great wrath, that is the dragon, and he is going to move quickly because he has a short time. And we know how long that short time is because Daniel 12 tells us it is a time, times, and half a time, 3.5 years, great tribulation. And there's the picture. And so from that, we can then start to look back at this context and realize that the whole narrative of the dragon being kicked out of heaven, being evicted, is happening at the start of the day of the Lord. Now, why does this matter? I mean, obviously it matters for the sake of understanding the narrative and what's going on and piecing these things together. But the other question I have is why? Why does God choose to do this here? What's going on? It's one thing to understand the timeline of what's going on. It's another thing to understand the reason for it. What's God's point in this? Why build it this way? So I believe it's very clear that this is an event Daniel records, and it helps us make sense of where to put this scene. Daniel 11 describes the king of the north and his rise and culmination of his power. This would be our ominous man of lawlessness and how he shows up, how he culminates all of his power over the nations, and it includes listing his conflicts and defeats and victories. But Daniel 12 describes how he is defeated by God, completing the details that were previously provided in Daniel 7 and 8. Daniel 12 begins by introducing Michael, and this is his second appearance. If you go back into Daniel chapter 10, you'll see Michael referenced 2 other times, verse 13 and verse 21. And in that context, Daniel's been praying, and finally an answer comes in the form of a messenger. And the messenger comes down and begins to describe to Daniel the answer. But before he gives him the answer, he explains why he didn't show up sooner. It's probably funny to Daniel because Daniel had no expectation of somebody showing up to personally deliver a message. But the angel gives an explanation, saying effectively that from the moment Daniel started praying, the angel would have been there. But he was hindered. He was stopped by one he calls the Prince of Persia, and he references the Prince of Greece. And he's referencing whatever this spiritual warfare that's going on behind the scenes. But how he was able to finish delivering the message is because Michael, the archangel, shows up militaristically and allows this angel to go and give the message to Daniel for the sake of Israel, for the sake of the woman. And so Michael's function here, when you start to put all the pieces together, is he arises militaristically. He is called up, he is summoned up to kick the dragon out of heaven, which will then begin the Great Tribulation. But again, going back to my question, why this way? Well, in the Greek translation of this point in Daniel 12, at least one of them, it says that accompanying the rise of this king, or accompanying the rise of Michael the great prince, they're specifically designated as the great prince who stands guard, accompanying that is a rise of a time of tribulation, such tribulation as has not been from the time that there was a nation until the earth at that time. And at that time, thy people shall be delivered, specifically everyone that is written in the book. So when John sees Michael waging war in heaven against the dragon and his angels, we see the event which will accompany both the abomination of desolation and the beginning of the Great Tribulation. This is further clarified when we add to this the fact that the dragon, upon being cast down, what is the first thing he do when he's kicked out? He goes after the woman. He tries to go after Israel again and is hindered. He is stopped. He is delayed. As such, it is possible that the 2 wings of the great eagle that will be referenced as taking the woman away could be in reference to Michael, though it's not naming him, which is an odd thing to do. That's a fun little point of speculation. But what I think is more interesting is in 2 Thessalonians 2, and I'll briefly read that here. I mean, I've read this text 1,000 times, but just to kind of piece together what's being said here, Paul does something rather confusing in this chapter because he uses a title, not a verb, but a title. You can see what I mean in a minute here. So in chapter 2, now we request of you, brethren, with regard to the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together with him, that you not be quickly shaken from your composure or disturbed as if by a spirit or a message or a letter as if it had come from us, to the effect that the day of the Lord has come. So he's looking at that period, and they were afraid that it had already showed up. Let no one in any way deceive you. For it will not come unless the apostasy comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction. This is the king, the man of lawlessness, the little horn that we're talking about, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, which is almost verbatim the way he's described in Daniel 11, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God. Do you not remember that while I was still with you, I was telling you these things? Now note what he says here. And you know what restrains him now, so that in his time he will be revealed. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains will do so until he is taken out of the way. And then that lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will slay with the breath of his mouth and bring to an end by the appearance of his coming. That is, the one whose coming is in accord with the activity of Satan, with all power and signs and false wonders and so on. So Paul's not just giving a theological thesis on eschatology. He's telling you a list of events because that's what he's answering. The question was, in reference to the event of the day of the Lord, of this great tribulation, this 3.5 years, did we miss it or did we not? And I love the fact that Paul gives such a detailed answer. Paul does not reference the abomination of desolation by name. He does not mention the rapture here. He doesn't mention those things because that's not the emphasis here. He doesn't mention any of those things because he's narrowing down his focus to three things. The apostasy, which is tied with the revealing of the man of lawlessness, which is tied to the activity of the devil. So if the devil is cast down to the earth because Michael the archangel arises and kicks him out, and the devil's on the earth, and he, having great wrath, is motivated because he understands how short amount of time he has to work, then goes to work, you will see more activity. He will be very active. That's why the woe is given to the earth and to the sea. Because the dragon has been cast out, having great wrath, being very active is another way to say it. He has intent. He realizes he's on the clock now. He's running out of time. And so, in tandem with that, it makes sense that the coming of the man of lawlessness would be in accord with that sudden increase in activity that he's revealed. But then there was that phrase, and I'll just briefly allude to my speculation. That's the answer. It doesn't say just what restrains the man of lawlessness. It says he who restrains. It's referencing an individual. And my theory as to who that is referencing is Michael. Because the only time you see anybody by name show up in any reference to the dragon and conflict and restraint and the man of lawlessness in the day of the Great Tribulation is Michael. He shows up by name. He's an individual and only shows up a handful of times. And then in 1 Thessalonians, Paul references the voice of the archangel. So all of those details to effectively say that this event of the Great Tribulation, in my bigger chart, everything kind of clusters around that because so much is tied into it. So basically, we have some ramifications for this. What we can do with this. This war is one-sided. Right? Pulling out the grand scheme of the universe, going into the incomprehensible design of heaven and the narrative of what's going on. One of the things you realize is by the grand scheme of things, the devil is relatively small. He only has control in this picture of 7 nations as they're represented in his head. That's all he has. So when the forcible eviction shows, God announces and calls up Michael to get up and go carry out the task. If you're the devil, and your sole job has never been to destroy necessarily. You can't. You can be given permission to do certain things, but your job is to level accusations over and over and over. So if you're the devil and you've been approaching the throne day and night trying to come up with accusations and evidence against people and go over and over and over, and then, of course, it's already bad enough that the gospel happens, and now there's a defender there in the form of a high priest, and not only is he the high priest, he's the judge himself, so things were already tricky enough, and you know a day of judgment is coming, and therefore you know your place in heaven has to be temporary, and your place in heaven is, in a sense, kind of useless, in the fact that you can level as many accusations as you want, but in the face of Christ, there's really nothing that can be made to stick. Then when God calls up Michael, the militaristic angel whose sole function is in reference to the nation that you've been trying so desperately to destroy, you're going to come to a quick realization if you're in the devil's footless shoes. It's happening. That thing that the demons were so worried about when Christ was initially on the earth is now happening. It's often people think that the Great Tribulation is the Great Tribulation because it's the day of Satan's wrath. That is not why it is the Great Tribulation. He only has great wrath because he knows his time is short. He's trying to make the best with what he has, and that's not much. It is the day of tribulation because it is the day of God's wrath. It is the day of his vengeance. It is the day when he will come with a robe dipped in blood and judgment, and he, as we have discussed throughout this point, up to this point, has been the one behind killing of trillions of people. It is the day of God's great wrath and judgment, and no one is able to stand other than the ones he allows to. And so here the dragon understands what's going on. He understands probably better than most what this means when Michael is shown up, as it were, is in his, for the sake of illustration, in his heavenly temporary apartment. Here comes Michael knocking with the eviction notice. The devil's panicking. This war is one-sided. We know that Michael is already a very strong opponent. That's why he shows up, and when he shows up, he never seems to lose. And this is reinforced by the fact that his name is specifically used here to describe how the devil is kicked out of heaven. It's not just, and there was war and angels kicked him out. Michael is brought up by name. It is quite apparent that Michael is likely one of the strongest angels utilized in this sort of warfare. He is clearly very effective at what he does. However, it is easy to then get lost in speculation as to, wow, what must Michael be like, and what does he do? Well, let's look at what Michael does. We can get an idea of his attitude. It's referenced in Jude. We'll say Jude 1, but then be somewhat redundant. But in Jude, he references Michael. And he uses it as an illustration of a certain point. There are men who go and revile angelic majesties because they think way too highly of themselves, and they think that the demons bend their knees to their own power, and they really don't. And these guys, like the brothers who decided they were going to try to cast out demons, and they did this in the name of Paul. And of course, the demon responds, I know who Christ is, and I know who Paul is. I don't know who you guys are, and proceeds to beat them up and send them out rather humiliated. So, in that reference of these people who think very highly of themselves and their authority, Jude references them and talks about them reviling angelic majesties about which these guys have no understanding. And then to really nail in his point, he brings up Michael. And what does he say about Michael? That even Michael, in his position and authority and effectiveness, even he does not rebuke the devil. Even he doesn't pull the devil aside and tell him what for. He waits. What does he do in that context when he's disputing with the devil about the body of Moses there in Jude? He says, the Lord rebuke you. Michael is just the instrument. His effectiveness is simply by design as to be a sort of funnel for God's effectiveness. So the devil isn't running because he's afraid of Michael. He's afraid of what Michael was designed for and who is using it. So we start to understand why the devil's afraid. When Michael is seen disputing with the devil over the body of Moses, we are told that Michael did not dare pronounce against the devil a railing judgment, but said, the Lord rebuke you. And we are in the day of the Lord here in this text, so it makes sense why the dragon does not stand a chance. That's why it's a one-sided war. It is ultimately not Michael casting him out, but God. And the Lord, in this context, is rebuking him. And he's not just rebuking him as a slap on the wrist, he is driving him out. And so the Lord effectively looks at the dragon to kind of tie those two between Jude here and Revelation 12 and rebukes him, and Michael gets up, and now it's time. And so the Lord rebukes him, and he is using Michael as the instrument of choice to forcibly remove him from heaven once for all, and we never see the devil entering the presence of God again. It doesn't happen. You don't find it again. He is thrown down to the earth. When Christ returns, he is bound up and thrown into the abyss for the 1,000-year reign. After the 1,000 years, he is led up where he tries to gather the nations again. He loses very soundly and very quickly in less than a sentence, and then is immediately thrown into the lake of fire. He does not stand in the day of judgment. He is not referenced as standing in the day of judgment. He goes straight in. Everyone else gets to have a little bit of weight, other than the beast and the false prophet. They get to go straight in too. But he is never standing in the presence of God again. The role that he fulfilled, his place in heaven, is done. And that's really the key point here. As to why all of this is happening, what's the doctrinal reality that we're looking at here? When he hits the earth, that is the dragon, and begins to move quickly, he is doing this in a panic. Not for the fear of Michael coming after him, but because of one far more powerful than heaven's most powerful angel. Hebrews chapter 1 is a phenomenal read, and I would read it if I had more time, but I don't. What does Hebrews 1 go out of its way to say? You think angels are great, you think angels are wonderful and powerful, but none of the angels are even remotely comparable to Christ. And what Christ would do, and his function, and what he chooses to do with the earth. And even when the disciples are panicking about him being arrested, Jesus said, "Don't you think I can summon legions of angels if I so desired?" That's who the devil's running from. It seems quite probable that the residents of heaven watch as this goes down. They see him being kicked out. They see this conflict that is so one-sided. And so it is probable that the residents of heaven watch in joy as the dragon is thrown out of heaven, kicking and screaming as his armies are quite visibly no match for God. It's a demonstration, really. It's kind of a display. So this makes it all the more apparent that the devil and his angels were only ever permitted to be there. And when God declared that their time was up, they are here seen to be immediately and violently evicted. And it is this divine eviction which communicates to the devil that the day of the Lord is here. Thus, his panic. And this is really the fallout of the war. There is no longer a place for Satan and his angels in heaven. And let's go back, and this is where we'll wind it down here. Let's go back. What is the devil's function? Why does he have a place there to begin with? If you were to walk into the courtroom of heaven and you looked at people's name tags and what their roles were, you see Michael the archangel who stands guard over the great prince who stands guard over your people Israel, and there's Gabriel the messenger, and oh look, there's the apostles, we know what they do, and then there's the dragon, and underneath his name, or names, you see the title, the prosecutor, the accuser. His job is to go out and gather evidence and level accusations. Why? Why does he do this? And this is in reference to the gospel. That he is allowed to level accusations against us. He can go and tempt us to trip and fall and sin and fail and say stupid things and do dumb things and look terrible and look inconsistent, and can gather all of that technically legitimate evidence up and then bring it up to the throne where it is all absolutely invalidated because of our defender or the high priest who stands for us. And so all of the evidence is invalidated, but he keeps trying. And this constantly demonstrates not our righteousness, it clearly demonstrates the lack of that. It goes on to demonstrate, as Paul says, the righteousness of God there in Romans. That the righteousness of God is demonstrated that, substitutionarily speaking, the atonement for sin all comes down to the person of Christ. And so the devil keeps throwing accusations against us, but he can't throw accusations against Christ. And so this process is constantly repeating. That the high priest stands in the presence of God perpetually, having completed his work and invalidating every charge that's brought against us. Thus, Paul's statement there in Romans, who can level a charge against us? Who can accuse us? Who can cut us off? And that's where Paul's answer comes in. And like I began with, when considering the scope of the universe and how intricately it is designed and how far it goes, and then realizing that no accusation, no matter how far it travels and no matter how grand in scale, stands a chance at all. That nothing, neither depth, nor men, nor powers, and principalities, nor even myself, can separate me from the love of God and from the work of Christ. And so all of that is embodied in this moment, and the devil is constantly demonstrating that over and over and over, because the gospel door is still open. Because there are still people being saved. But when the gospel's finished, when the fullness of the Gentiles has come in and God's purpose is now wrapping up for the gospel, and the time of grace and mercy and patience is coming to its conclusion, and the door is shut in, the prosecutor no longer has a role. His purpose is over. His position is invalid. It is no longer relevant. He was only ever demonstrating the victory of Christ anyway, but now even that is going to be demonstrated by Christ firsthand, and so the devil is of no use. He is done. His role, he's fired. He's canned. He's given the pink slip. He's given the boot. He's kicked out the door, cleaned out his desk, and you can go and run to the earth if you want. You can try to hide out there for a bit, but just know, and the devil knows, again, better than we do, what this event means, what is coming behind it. And so, like I said before, if you're on the earth and you hear that the king is coming, And you begin to see certain messengers who normally stand in the presence of God perpetually, the two witnesses. Their whole title is that they stand before the Lord, and yet they're seen on the earth. And then they try to kill them, but they're not allowed to because they die, and then they come back up 3 days later, and that didn't work out. And you see the effects in heaven now showing up on the earth more clearly, and you see all these things, and then the temple is being measured out. And begin to realize that now the prosecutor, who used to be in the presence of God, like those two olive trees, the two witnesses, he also was accusing day and night. Now he's now done with that. He's down here. What does that mean is coming? All of these things are like if a storm was coming and it was throwing debris, and you began to see debris landing all around you, and you realize that the storm is coming because it's throwing it that way and it's following it. So the world's deceiver is thrown out of the throne room and heaven itself. This is not to make him seem more dreadful or powerful, but rather it indicates that the head of the snake is being severed. This is the one who deceives the whole world. The children of God rejoice as the father of lies is cast out of heaven and down to the earth to be with his own children during the judgment. When the devil is bound in the abyss for the 1,000 years, the side effect is that unbelievers in the world cease to rebel. But then he comes out and they try again. But really, all of this, the God of this world, the deceiver of the world and of the nations, the dragon, the head of the snake itself, the accuser of the brethren, has been cast down. And there in not only Thessalonians, when the voice of the archangel is mentioned, what does it make in reference to? What context was Paul describing there? He was describing the last trumpet and then the dead rising, the resurrection, the second coming of Christ and the resurrection of the dead, and all of these things culminating in that moment. Daniel 12 references the same thing. When Michael the great prince stands up and there will be a time of great tribulation, it then doesn't stop there. He then references the resurrection of the dead. So I will end with 1 Corinthians 15. And again, note the tone. This is something I'll begin with next time, but at no point are we ever given the idea that this day of the Lord is a day for us to be afraid of, us to be nervous of. This seems to be some narrative, and I increasingly fail to understand why Christians are encouraged to be afraid of this time. Well, if the rapture comes after, then we'll be in it, and that wouldn't be comforting, which is such a silly argument. And well, it's persecution. Maybe incidentally, it's kind of alluded to as a detail, but what's the biblical attitude towards these things? And the biblical attitude is almost universally positive for us. And in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul's discussing the resurrection. I'm not going to read the whole chapter because that would take me a while. But Paul's discussing the resurrection. And if we go down to verse 20, you note there when I was reading in Revelation 12, something is said. The kingdom of our God is coming like his power, but then it makes a point to say, and the authority of his Christ. And that's where I wanted to pivot off of this, and we'll deal with it again next time. But in chapter 15, verse 20, but now Christ has been raised from the dead, the firstfruits of those who are asleep. For since by one man came death, by a man also came the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ all will be made alive. But each to his own order. Christ the firstfruits, and after that those who are Christ at his coming. And then comes the end, when he hands over the kingdom to the God and Father, when he has abolished all rule and all authority and power. And he's not just referencing people there. Even the devil, the ruler or the God of this world, has also been abolished. For he must reign until he has put all of his enemies under his feet. And the last enemy that will be abolished is death. For he has put all things into subjection under his feet. But when he says all things are put into subjection, it is evident that he is accepted who put all the things in subjection to him. In other words, kind of narrow down the focus that all things being subjected come down under Christ specifically. And when all of the things have been subjected to him, then the Son himself will also be subjected to the one who subjected all things to him. Why? Why go through all of this process? Why is God casting the devil out? And why does Christ have to reign on the earth for 1,000 years? And all of these ins and outs and processes. When all of these things are subjected to Christ, and the Son himself also will be subjected to God the Father, who subjected all the things to him, so that God will be all in all. all things summing up in God, all things coming back down to the point where they started, all back to the source. And all of the things that we cover, I guarantee the devil understands eschatology. He understands what's coming. And as we'll get into, maybe next time, depending on how quickly we get through this next part, because this might take a while, he's in a panic. He is afraid. He has great wrath, but that's more just him kicking. He's moving quickly. And the earth is in a panic. Oddly enough, like I said, right, Michael rises, begins the Great Tribulation. Michael arises, kicks the devil out, Great Tribulation. Well, where does the Great Tribulation begin earlier in Revelation? We go, if you think about the timing of this, and I'll end with this point, because this is cool. I say that the Great Tribulation begins in the breaking of the sixth seal. But something happens before the breaking of the sixth seal. There are martyrs seen under the altar, those who have been slain for their faith. And what's their question? How long, O Lord, until you avenge us? Now, you avenge our blood on those on the earth. How long until your wrath begins? And this is the legitimate question they're asking. They're not doubting, they're not impatient, they're asking. How much longer? When's this stuff beginning? And then after that, they are told they have to wait a little while longer until the remainder of their brethren are to be slain as they had been. And then the next seal is broken. And the next seal is broken, and what do the people of the earth do? They run. They run to the caves. They run and hide. And they beg for the mountains to fall on them. Why? They have the same fear that their father, the devil, has. Because the day of God's wrath has come, and who is able to stand? Even the devil himself is running. And if you think about that chronologically, that means that here you have the saints under the altar who are martyred, and they're asking God how long until the judgment begins, and God tells them to wait a little while longer, and then turns around, and at some point soon after that, calls up to Michael to evict the devil. The devil's thrown down to the earth, and the earth is in a panic. He is in a panic because they know the day has begun. He knows it's begun. Everyone's in a panic. And all of this, right after the saints just asked, how long? And then the devil, maybe within earshot, hears that and begins to realize it's time. So all of these things, when tied together, just paint such a clear picture of absolute, undeniable victory. Throughout the entire thing, every single step along the way is to illustrate that point. So, next time, we'll get into the ramifications. This declaration that's made as he's kicked out, and now what has happened as a result. And it should be exciting. It should be something we look forward to. It should be thrilling because of what this means. If heaven's told to rejoice, and we're residents of there, then I don't see a reason why we should be afraid of this. Well, we'll deal with more of that next time. Let's pray. Thank you, Father, for this glimpse into the coming victory and all of the intricate planning that has gone into it, and that we get to have a small sample of what is going on, why, and what it's all leading to. And that we are not simply told that we are more than conquerors, we are shown it, and why and how it all works out. So I thank you not only that we have this confidence looking into the future, but that we have this confidence now, knowing where these things are going, and that our enemy is a toothless lion. So I ask that we take that into account and keep in mind that these things are short and our time is temporary, and that we make the most of this time, knowing that all these things are to be destroyed in this way. So help us think clearly about why we're still here, what is to come, and what we are to do with it. We thank you for these things in Jesus' name. Amen.